Voices from the Crypt. In the autumn of 1927, deep in the forested hills of Vermont's Green Mountains, a young priest made a discovery that would forever change his understanding of the world. Emmeram's church, in the sleepy village of Darkwood, had stood on its stone foundation for over 400 years, but beneath its venerable facade lay a secret that would terrify even the most experienced clergy. Father Thomas Ashford was only 28 years old when he took over his first parish, an idealistic young man from Boston, filled with the desire to provide spiritual guidance to the people in this remote village. What he didn't know, he was already the seventh priest in just 20 years. The others had all disappeared under mysterious circumstances, or had fled their duties, marked by experiences they never wanted to speak of again. Darkwood, in 1927, was a village that time seemed to have forgotten. Only 200 souls lived here, hidden in a valley so deeply cut into the Green Mountains that the sun in winter barely climbed over the ridges. The houses huddled close together, as if seeking protection from something invisible. Colonial-era houses with crooked beams and crumbling plaster, their small windows like suspicious eyes looking out onto the narrow lanes. The streets were unpaved, turning into muddy channels when it rained. In the center of the village stood an old well whose water tasted of sulfur. The locals claimed the well had been cursed since a child drowned in it in the 17th century. No one drank from it anymore. And above it all loomed Emmeram's church, a massive structure of dark gray stone whose pointed steeple rose like an accusing finger toward the sky. The steeple was crooked, an almost imperceptible tilt to the east, as if the building were trying to turn away from something lurking in the west. The bells rang twice daily, morning and evening, and their sound had something hollow, eerie about it. Some said you could hear the screams of the dead in the bell ringing if you listened closely enough. The church had been built in 1623, precisely during the time when the Puritans were establishing their foothold in New England. The master builder had been a certain Jonathan Coldstone, a man about whom the chronicles reveal little. What is known, however, he had built on the foundations of an even older structure, a Native American sacred site that was said to have stood at this location 1,000 years before Christ. Beneath the church stretched an extensive crypt, a labyrinth of stone corridors and vaults, where the village's dead had found their final rest for centuries. The air down there was cold and damp, saturated with the sweet musty smell of decay. Candles cast flickering shadows on the walls, on which strange symbols were carved. Symbols that didn't seem to fit with Christian faith. Thomas Ashford had entered the crypt for the first time on the third day after his arrival. The old sexton, a taciturn man named Frederick Bergman, had reluctantly led him down. Bergman was over 70 years old, with a face that looked like leather-tanned wood. His eyes were deep-set in their sockets, and when he spoke, his voice sounded like the grinding of gravel under heavy boots. "Father Ashford," Bergman had said in a muted voice as they descended the stone spiral staircase, "there are rules down here. First rule, never come down here after dark. Second rule, never come down here alone. And third rule, the most important, if you hear voices, don't listen. Understand? Just don't listen." Thomas had laughed, a nervous, uncertain laugh. "Voices? Do you mean the rats? Or the wind whistling through the cracks?" Bergman had scrutinized him with a look that stifled all mirth. "I mean the voices, Father. The voices of those who cannot rest. The voices of those who are waiting down here for something. And if you're smart, you'll make sure that waiting never ends." The first weeks in Darkwood passed surprisingly quietly for Thomas Ashford. The villagers were taciturn but polite. They came to service, confessed their small sins, and lived their lives within the narrow boundaries prescribed by their traditions. But Thomas sensed something, a tension vibrating beneath the surface, an unspoken secret that everyone shared but no one wanted to speak aloud. The church itself was an impressive structure. The nave was high and narrow, the stained glass windows showing scenes from the lives of saints. But the longer Thomas looked at the depictions, the more strange details he noticed. There were faces in the backgrounds that seemed too distorted, too agonized for religious art. There were symbols in the borders that he couldn't find in any liturgical text, and there was always a recurring motif that ran through all the windows, an open mouth from which something seemed to be crawling out, something dark, formless. It was in the 4th week that Thomas first heard the voices. He had been sitting up late into the night in his study at the rectory, working on his sermon for the coming Sunday. The rectory was built directly onto the church, and through the thick stone walls you could sometimes hear the deep rumble of the organ when the wind blew through the pipes. It was shortly after midnight. The candle on his desk flickered in the draught, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind howled through the narrow lanes of the village, tugging at the shutters. A typical autumn storm in the green mountains that made the trees tremble to their roots. But what Thomas heard that evening was not the organ. It was a murmuring, a multi-voiced, penetrating murmuring that seemed to come from the depths. At first he thought it was the pipes of the old heating system, but then he began to understand individual words, English words, but in a dialect so old and foreign that he could barely interpret them. It sounded like Middle English, mixed with something even older, perhaps Native American or a long-forgotten language. "Let us out. So cold down here. We wait so long." Thomas jumped up, his heart hammering against his ribs. The voices were clearly coming from the direction of the church. He grabbed his flashlight and a candle, hesitated a moment, and then remembered Bergman's warning, never after dark, never alone. But curiosity was stronger, and duty. If something was wrong in his church, then he had to check. That was his responsibility as a priest. The church was shrouded in deep darkness when Thomas entered through the side door. His flashlight cast a narrow beam of light through the nave. The statues of saints on the walls cast long, distorted shadows. And the murmuring was now clearer. It was definitely coming from below, from the crypt. The heavy oak door to the crypt stood a crack open. Thomas was certain he had locked it in the afternoon. With trembling hands he pushed it further open. The spiral staircase lay before him, a black spiral leading down into the depths, and from down there came the murmuring, now mixed with something else. A sobbing, a laughing, he couldn't distinguish. Step by step, Thomas descended. The walls were damp, covered with a slippery film of moss and other things he didn't want to think about. The voices became louder, not louder in volume, but denser. There were more of them, dozens, hundreds perhaps. A chorus of whispers and murmurs, of pleas and laments. At the foot of the stairs opened the first vaulted room of the crypt. Thomas directed the beam of his flashlight into the darkness. Rows of niches were carved into the walls, in which lay the coffins of the villagers, some of wood, long since decayed, others of stone, with weathered inscriptions. And in the corners, bones were stacked, neatly layered, skulls on ribs, arms and legs, arranged in macabre patterns. The voices were coming from the back part of the crypt, there, where the older areas lay, there, where the vaults transitioned into natural caves that had existed long before the church. Thomas forced himself to continue. The floor beneath his feet was uneven, littered with rubble and bone fragments. His breath formed white clouds in the icy air, and the voices led him deeper, ever deeper, into the stone labyrinth. Then he saw it. At the end of a particularly narrow passage, half hidden behind a collapsed masonry, was a door. Not an ordinary door. It was made of solid iron, covered with rust and strange symbols. Symbols that Thomas knew from his studies. Protection signs, banishment signs, seals against evil, pentagrams and crosses, intertwined. Runes he couldn't decipher. And in the middle of the door, at eye level, a symbol that made him particularly shudder, an open mouth from which serpents crawled, exactly like on the church windows. The door vibrated, a slight trembling, as if something on the other side were pressing against it. No, not just something, many things. Many hands, many bodies, hammering against the metal, scratching, scraping, and the voices came from there. Dozens, no, hundreds of voices, all speaking at once, pleading, screaming. Men's voices, women's voices, children's voices. A chorus of despair that gripped Thomas's heart in icy fingers. Open the door. Set us free. We have waited so long. You are the seventh. The seventh will do it. Thomas Ashford stumbled backward. The flashlight slipped from his sweaty hands and rolled across the floor. The light whirled wildly through the crypt, casting dancing shadows on the walls. And in these shadows, Thomas thought he saw figures, human outlines that moved, that reached for him. He ran like he had never run in his life. Up the stairs, through the church, back to the rectory. Only when he had slammed the door behind him and locked it did he dare to breathe again. His hands trembled so badly he could barely pour himself a glass of water. What had he seen down there? Heard? Had it been real? Or was he imagining things, driven by loneliness and the gloomy atmosphere of this place? The next morning, Thomas Ashford sought out Frederick Bergman. He found the old sexton in the sacristy, where he was just preparing the liturgical vestments for Sunday service. Bergman's hand stopped when he saw Thomas's face. "You were down there," said Bergman. It wasn't a question, but a statement. Thomas nodded. The door, the iron door at the end of the eastern passage. What's behind it? Bergman slowly folded the vestments. His movements were deliberate, as if he had heard this question many times and given the answer just as often. Sit down, Father. It's time you learned the truth about street Emmerams. The story Bergman told reached back to the year 1623, when the church was built. Master builder Jonathan Coldstone had not been an ordinary architect. He was a scholar of the occult sciences, a man who claimed he could speak with demons. The Puritan settlement of New England was in its early chaotic days, and in this chaos, men like Coldstone had found room for experiments that the church would never have tolerated under normal circumstances. Coldstone had built on the ruins of a Native American sacred site, a place where the indigenous peoples had not buried their dead, but sealed them. They believed that the souls of the deceased could be trapped in this place, bound to the physical world through powerful rituals, and Coldstone had mixed these ancient practices with Christian mysticism. The iron door, Bergman explained in a quiet voice, seals a chamber in which Coldstone holds the souls of 83 people captive, people who died between 1623 and 1627, plague victims, criminals, and others about whom the chronicles are silent. Coldstone claimed he could use the power of these trapped souls to protect the church, to protect the village. "That's madness," whispered Thomas. "That's heresy. That's the truth," Bergman interrupted him. "And every priest who comes here eventually hears the voices, the souls in the sealed chamber. They call for liberation. They promise all sorts of things: power, knowledge, wealth. But above all, they promise that the suffering will end if one opens the door." "And what happens if the door is opened?" Bergman's face went pale. "No one knows for sure. But there were priests who tried. Father Matthias Wagner in 1893. He opened the door a crack. They found him 3 days later in the forest. His hair had turned white, and he could only scream. He died a week later in an asylum. Father Henry Wolfe in 1911. He tried to break the seals. The villagers heard screams from the church that night. When they checked in the morning, Wolfe had disappeared. They only found his torn cassock in front of the iron door. Thomas Ashford felt sick. Why hasn't the church done anything? Why wasn't the crypt sealed? The church torn down? "They tried," Bergman replied. In 1847, a delegation came from Rome. They wanted to exorcise the church, renew the seals, or tear down the building. But the night before they could begin their work, a fire broke out in the inn where they were staying. All 7 churchmen died. The inn itself remained unscathed. Only the room where the delegation slept burned completely. There are powers here, Bergman continued, that don't want the seals to be broken. But there are also powers that want exactly that. And both sides use us humans as pawns in a game whose rules we don't understand. In the following weeks, Thomas Ashford tried to ignore the voices. He concentrated on his daily duties, on the services, pastoral care, the administration of the parish. But the voices wouldn't leave him alone. At night, when he lay in bed, he heard them penetrating through the walls. During the day, when he prayed in the church, he felt their presence like an icy breath on the back of his neck. The villagers noticed the change. Thomas became thinner, paler. Dark circles formed under his eyes. His sermons became confused, jumping from one topic to another. He spoke of redemption and damnation, of guilt and atonement, of things trapped between heaven and hell. Then, in the 6th week, something happened that changed everything. A young woman from the village, Mary Woodman, came to confession. She was 19 years old, the daughter of the blacksmith, a pretty girl with long dark hair and startlingly light blue eyes. She knelt in the confessional and began to speak, but the voice that came from her mouth was not her own. "Thomas Ashford," said the voice, deep and old, "we know you. We know your doubts, your fears, your desire for knowledge and truth. Open the door, Thomas. Set us free, and we will show you what lies beyond the veil. We will reveal to you the secrets of the universe." Thomas jumped out of the confessional. Mary Woodman lay on the floor, her eyes rolled back, only the whites visible. Her body twitched in convulsions. Foam stood at her mouth. "Help!" Thomas screamed. "Someone help me!" Villagers rushed in. They carried Mary out, laid her on a bench in the nave. Slowly, the convulsions subsided. Mary's eyes opened, clear and confused. She had no memory of what had happened. But the message was clear. The voices from the crypt were no longer willing to wait. They were becoming stronger, more demanding, and they had begun to reach the living. If this story gives you goosebumps, then you understand why we must never forget these dark chapters of American history. Share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Give a thumbs up to support our work, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss stories like this. Let's discover together what secrets are still hidden in America's past. Thomas Ashford knew he needed help. He couldn't solve this problem alone, so he wrote a letter to his old professor from the seminary, Dr. Leonard Krauss. Krauss was not only a theologian, but also an expert in church history and demonology. If anyone knew how to deal with a situation like this, it was him. Krauss arrived in Darkwood 5 days later, a gaunt man of about 60 years, with sharp, intelligent eyes behind rimless glasses. He wore a black suit that was worn at the elbows and a hat that had seen better days. In his hand, he held a worn leather bag decorated with strange symbols, symbols that made Thomas feel uneasy, though he couldn't have said why. Krauss had the aura of a man who had seen too much, known too much, and looked too long into the abysses of human existence. He listened to Thomas's story without moving a muscle. His fingers occasionally drummed on the armrest of his chair, a nervous tick that revealed he knew more than he initially disclosed. Then he asked to see the crypt. Frederick Bergman led the 2 men down. This time they went with several lanterns, armed with holy water and crucifixes. Krauss had also taken an old book from his bag, bound in black leather, its pages filled with handwritten Latin texts. The voices began to whisper as soon as they entered the spiral staircase. But Krauss seemed unimpressed. He walked through the vaults, examined the symbols on the walls, took notes in a leather-bound book. Sometimes he stopped, murmured words in a language Thomas didn't know, and observed how the shadows seemed to react to his words. When they reached the iron door, Krauss stood before it for a long time. He stretched out his hand, touched the metal. Immediately the voices began to rage, a hurricane of screams and pleas. "Interesting," Krauss murmured. "The seals are old, but still intact. Jonathan Coldstone must have been a remarkable occultist. This combination of Native American symbolism and Christian mysticism is unusual." "What's behind it?" asked Thomas. "What keeps the door locked?" Krauss withdrew his hand. "Souls, as your sexton already mentioned. But not just souls. Coldstone created something that in demonological literature is called a collective spirit. The 83 individual souls have merged into an entity with its own will, its own consciousness. And this entity is powerful, very powerful. "Can we free them?" asked Thomas. "Can we give them peace?" Krauss shook his head. "The question isn't whether we can. The question is whether we should. This entity is 500 years old. 500 years of anger, despair, hunger for freedom. If the seals are broken, then what comes out will not be human. It will be a force that wants only one thing: revenge on the living." "Then we leave the door locked," Thomas decided. "It's not that simple," Krauss replied. "The seals weaken over time. Every time a living person hears the voices, when the entity makes contact with the upper world, it consumes energy. Energy that attacks the seals. Your predecessor, Father William Schneider, fled 6 months ago. Since then, the church has had no priest. 6 months in which no one performed the rituals that strengthen the seals." "What rituals?" asked Thomas in alarm. Bergman coughed. "I wanted to show you, Father, but you seemed not yet ready for it." The old sexton led them to a hidden room in the sacristy. There, in a leather-bound chest, lay a book. Not an ordinary book, but a handwritten manuscript, bound in something that looked suspiciously like human skin. The pages were covered with a scrawling Old English script. "The Testament of Jonathan Coldstone," Bergman explained. "He wrote it shortly before his death. In it he describes the creation of the sealed chamber, the binding of souls, and the rituals necessary to maintain the seals." Krauss leafed through the book. His expression became increasingly serious. This is incredible. Coldstone didn't just capture the souls, he made a contract. A pact with powers older than Christianity. The entity in the sealed chamber is not just a collective spirit of trapped souls. It's a kind of guardian, a patron saint for this village. As long as the seals hold, the entity protects Darkwood from external dangers. But for this, it demands a price. "What price?" asked Thomas with a trembling voice. "Once a month, at the new moon, the priest must descend into the crypt. He must stand before the iron door and perform a ritual. A ritual in which he sacrifices part of his own life force to renew the seals." "Life force?" Thomas repeated in disbelief. "You mean—" "I mean exactly that," Krauss confirmed. "Every time the ritual is performed, the priest ages faster. His lifetime is literally consumed to feed the seals. That's why priests can never stay here long. That's why the priests of street Emmerams looked like old men after just a few years." Thomas sank into a chair. "That can't be. The church can't know this. That would be a scandal," Krauss completed the sentence. "But the church doesn't know. At least, not officially. The few bishops who have learned of this pact over the centuries have remained silent. Because what's the alternative? Break the seal and release the entity? That wouldn't just endanger Darkwood, but possibly the entire region." "There must be a way," Thomas said desperately. "There must be a way to free the souls without releasing the entity." Krauss shook his head. "If there were such a way, Coldstone would have written it in his testament. The man was obsessed with documenting his work. No, Thomas, you face a choice. Either you perform the rituals and sacrifice years of your life to protect the village, or you refuse, and the seals will break." What happens then? He left the sentence unfinished. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He lay in his bed at the rectory and stared at the ceiling. Through the thin walls, he heard the voices. Quieter now, almost tender. Thomas, they whispered. Good Thomas, you understand us. You know we suffer. 500 years, Thomas. 500 years in darkness, in cold, without hope, without mercy. Open the door, Thomas. Let us finally go. And for the first time, in the silence of the night, Thomas wondered if the voices weren't perhaps right. If it wasn't more cruel to keep them captive than to give them the freedom they so desperately sought. The next day was a Sunday. Thomas had to celebrate Mass. The small church was full. All the villagers had come. Krauss sat in the first row. Bergman stood at the back by the door. Thomas stepped to the altar, began the liturgy. But his thoughts were not on the service. They were below, in the crypt, at the iron door. During the sermon, Thomas noticed something strange. The villagers were staring at him, all of them, with empty eyes, as if they were waiting for something, as if they knew something he didn't know. After Mass, Thomas spoke with some of the older community members. Carefully, indirectly, he asked about the church's history, about the former priests. The answers were evasive, but a pattern became recognizable. The villagers knew about the sealed chamber. They knew about the pact, and they accepted it. For them, it was a necessary evil, a price to be paid for safety and protection. You understand, Father, said Anna Weaver, an old woman of over 80 years. Darkwood has never experienced war, never plagues, never famines. While the world around us burns, we are safe. That's no coincidence. That's the blessing of the crypt. The blessing? Thomas repeated, stunned. You call it a blessing that souls are kept in torment? The old woman shrugged. The dead are dead, Father. What does it matter where their souls dwell? The living must be protected. That's the natural order. Thomas realized in that moment that he was alone with his moral concerns. The entire village had come to terms with the situation. They had sold their souls for a life in safety. That evening, Thomas again sought out Dr. Krauss. I can't do it, he said. I can't sacrifice my life for a pact built on suffering and torment. There must be another way. Krauss sighed. I've been reading Coldstone's testament over the past few days, again and again, and I found something that Coldstone himself may have overlooked. The entity in the sealed chamber is not simply a collection of souls. It's a being that has developed its own identity through the pact, and like any being, it can possibly be convinced. Convinced? Asked Thomas. Of what? To leave voluntarily, to release the souls, not through breaking the seals, but through forgiveness, through redemption. That sounds like pious, wishful thinking. Possibly, Krauss admitted. But it's the only alternative I see. You would have to speak with the entity. Really speak, not just hear its voices. You would have to understand it, learn its history, and show it a way to find peace without taking revenge on the living. And how am I supposed to do that? Krauss opened Coldstone's testament to a specific page. There's a ritual, a dangerous ritual. It doesn't open the door physically, but it opens a spiritual channel. You could make direct contact with the entity. But Thomas, you must understand. If you do this, you're putting your soul at stake. The entity could try to take you over, corrupt you, or simply destroy you. Thomas thought for a long time. Then he said, I became a priest to save souls, not to enslave them. If there's a chance to free the 83 souls, then I must try. The ritual was to be performed on the night of the next new moon. That gave Thomas a week to prepare. He fasted, ate only bread and drank only water. He prayed for hours, knelt on the cold stone floor of the church until his knees bled. He studied Coldstone's testament into the early morning hours, trying to understand every word, every symbol. The pages of the book felt wrong under his fingers, as if they were made of something that had never been alive. Krauss supported him, explained the occult symbols and practices, helped him develop the right mental attitude. He taught Thomas protection spells, visualization techniques, and methods to shield his mind against demonic influences. The villagers noticed the preparations. They became nervous, restless. You could see them standing together in small groups, whispering, casting worried glances at the church. Anna Weaver came to the rectory and begged Thomas not to do what he intended. Her eyes were red from crying. Her hands trembled. "You will kill us all," she said with a broken voice. "When the crypt awakens, we will all die. Please, Father, let the dead rest." But Thomas was not deterred. He had made his decision, and deep inside he knew that this was the reason he had come to Darkwood. Not by chance, but by destiny. The night of the new moon was pitch black. No stars were visible in the sky. Thick clouds hung over the Green Mountains. Thomas, Krauss, and Bergman descended into the crypt. They carried candles, holy water, a crucifix of blessed silver, and Coldstone's testament. When they reached the iron door, the ritual began. Thomas drew symbols on the floor with chalk, symbols that formed a protective circle. He lit incense, spoke Latin prayers, and then, with a trembling voice, began to speak the words that Coldstone had written down. Words in a language he didn't understand, but whose power he could feel. The air in the crypt began to vibrate. The candles flickered wildly, threatening to go out, and the iron door began to glow. Not with heat, but with a cold blue light that made the shadows appear unnaturally long. Then, suddenly, it was silent. No more voices, no sounds, only an oppressive silence that was heavier than lead. And in this silence, the entity spoke. Thomas Ashford. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was male and female, old and young, a voice that seemed to speak from 83 throats. "You have called us. We are here." Thomas forced himself to remain calm. "I have come to speak with you, to hear your story, to understand." A laugh echoed through the crypt, cold, bitter, without joy. "Understand? What is there to understand? We were people like you. We lived, loved, suffered." And then came Coldstone. He promised us redemption. He promised us that our souls would ascend to heaven if we submitted to his ritual. But it was a lie. He caught us like animals. And here we are, 500 years later, still trapped. "I want to free you," said Thomas. "But not by breaking the seals. I want you to leave voluntarily, in peace, without anger." Again the laugh. "Peace? What peace can there be for us? We have become something that is no longer human. We are the sum of our torment, our hatred, our despair. When the seals break, what comes out will want only one thing: to destroy everything that lives." "But that's not what you really want," Thomas said urgently. "Deep inside you, beneath all the anger and despair, are still the souls of the 83 people. People with families, with hopes, with dreams. These people would not want innocents to suffer." Silence. Long silence. Then the entity spoke again, and this time the voice sounded different, quieter, more uncertain. "We remember the faces of our children, the warmth of the sun on our skin, the laughter, the singing, the life. But these memories fade. With each year, with each decade, they become weaker. Soon we will remember nothing but the darkness." "Then let go," Thomas said gently. "Let go of the memories. Let go of the anger. Let go of the despair. And go where you always belonged." "It's not that simple," the entity replied. "Coldstone's seals don't just keep us captive. They define us. Without them, we would simply cease to exist." "Isn't that better than dwelling in torment forever?" asked Thomas. A pause. Then, "Perhaps, but we are afraid, Thomas Ashford. Afraid of the nothingness. afraid of what comes after ceasing. Thomas understood. The entity wasn't evil in the true sense. It was frightened, an ancient, powerful force that was ultimately just a scared child afraid of the darkness. "I can't tell you what comes after death," Thomas said honestly. "No one can. But I believe it will be better than what you're experiencing now. I believe in redemption, in forgiveness, in grace. And I believe that even for you, after all the suffering, a place of rest awaits." "You believe," the entity repeated. "But you don't know." "No," Thomas admitted. "I don't know. But faith is sometimes all we have." Again, silence. This time, longer than before. Thomas felt something changing. The tension in the air lessened. The cold blue light of the iron door began to pulse, became weaker. Then the entity spoke one last time. And this time it was no longer 83 voices speaking as one, but individual voices, saying goodbye, one after another. "I was Peter, a farmer. I had 3 children. I was Margaret, a midwife. I helped bring life into the world. I was John, a carpenter. I built houses that still stand today. I was," name after name, life after life. 83 souls remembering who they had once been before Coldstone made them into something else. And then, quite suddenly, the blue light went out. The iron door stopped vibrating. The symbols on its surface began to fade, as if they had never been there. Thomas sank to his knees. Tears ran down his face. He didn't know if it had worked, if the souls were truly free, or if they had simply ceased to exist. But he knew he had done the right thing. Krauss laid a hand on his shoulder. "It's over," he said quietly. "Can you feel it? The presence is gone." Bergman stood before the iron door, his old eyes wide. "In all the years I've been here," he murmured, "I've never experienced such silence. They're really gone." In the following days, it became clear what Thomas's deed had accomplished. The iron door could be opened. Behind it lay a small chamber, empty except for some old bones and weathered parchments. Coldstone's notes, which precisely documented how he had captured the 83 souls and transformed them into an entity. These documents were sent to Rome. The church ordered a thorough investigation. Coldstone's work was condemned as heresy, his writings destroyed. The Crypt of Street. Emmeram's was blessed. The bones of the 83 received a proper Christian burial in the cemetery. But the greatest change could be felt in the village itself. The villagers, who had lived for centuries under the protection of the entity, had to learn to live without this protection. There was no longer a magical barrier that kept Darkwood safe from the dangers of the world. They were now like any other village, vulnerable and mortal. Some of the elders were bitter about it. They accused Thomas of destroying their heritage. But the younger ones, those not yet fully steeped in the old ways, saw it differently. They saw a chance for a new beginning, a chance to live without the dark burden their ancestors had carried. Thomas Ashford stayed another 3 years in Darkwood. Then he requested a transfer, not because he was fleeing from the past, but because his work there was done. The voices from the crypt had fallen silent. The 83 souls had found their peace. But sometimes, on quiet nights, when Thomas lay in bed and couldn't sleep, he heard a soft whisper, not threatening, not desperate, but grateful. "Thank you, Thomas. You freed us. May you yourself one day find the peace you gave us." And Thomas would then smile in the darkness and know with absolute certainty that he had done the right thing. Street Emmeram's church still stands today in Darkwood. The crypt is closed to visitors, but the church itself is a popular destination for tourists interested in dark history. A plaque at the entrance tells the official story, a medieval crypt that was sealed for safety reasons. But the true story, the story of Thomas Ashford and the 83 souls, only a few know. It is passed down from generation to generation, a secret that lives on in the shadows of history. Some say if you go to the church at the new moon and press your ear against the old, cold stone wall of the crypt, you can still hear voices. But not the desperate screams of trapped souls, but soft singing. A chorus of 83 voices finally resting in peace. If this story has captivated you this far, then you're exactly right with us. We explore the darkest and most fascinating secrets of American history. Stories that were forgotten, but should never be forgotten. Subscribe to our channel, activate the bell, and be there when we open the next dark chapter. Write in the comments what you think of this story. Do you believe in trapped souls? Have you ever experienced something inexplicable yourself? Let us know. And remember, the darkest secrets often hide right before our eyes. In the old churches, the quiet villages, the stories our grandparents didn't want to tell us, but we tell them. Because the truth, however frightening it may be, must be brought to light. Until next time, stay curious, stay brave, and vigilant. And never forget, the past is never truly dead. It still whispers to us, if we are truly ready to listen. The voices from the crypt have fallen silent forever, but their moving story lives on.